The last few weeks at our services here, we have been going through something that the Anglicans call the 5 marks of mission. And what this is 5 statements about what we think encompasses what mission is. Now, you might have grown up in sort of church in the 1980s that said, you all need to head down to the street corner and start preaching, and that's what mission is. It was in that context that the Anglicans said, we believe mission is far bigger and broader and deeper than that. And so they came up with these 5 points, which are to proclaim the good news of the kingdom, to teach, baptise and nurture new believers, to respond to human need by loving service, to transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence of every kind and pursue peace and reconciliation, and to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. Now, we've been working our way through these 5 statements. A couple of weeks ago, we had James Beck come and he talked to us about creation, so we're a little bit out of order. So today we're actually going back to do our final one, which is point 4, to transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence of every kind, and pursue peace and reconciliation. Just a small thing. Just, do it in your spare time. But here is a point that this is what we believe God's intention is, and God's intention is for his people. And I want to read you a passage that Jesus, that's based on a story Jesus told that gives some of this context for a desire to strive for justice. This is from Luke chapter 18, starting at verse 2. There was a judge in a certain city, Jesus said, who neither feared God nor cared about people. A widow of that city came to him repeatedly saying, "Give me justice in this dispute with my enemy." And the judge ignored her for a while. But finally he said to himself, "I don't fear God or care about people, but this woman is driving me crazy. I'm going to see that she gets justice because she is wearing me out with her constant requests." Then the Lord said, "Learn a lesson from this unjust judge. Even he rendered a just decision in the end. So don't you think God will surely give justice to his chosen people who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, God will grant justice to them quickly." I meant to cut off that last bit. There it is. "But when the Son of Man returns, many will he find on earth who have faith." Anyway, here we go. A passage about justice, about God longing to bring justice. God does not want to withhold justice. And all through scriptures, there is this pattern of God saying to his people, you have been undertaking unjust things. You've treated people unjustly. You're ripping off the poor, and God constantly corrects his people. This is not my dream and my pattern. You need to bring justice. You need to ensure that justice is done. So this morning, I want to think about this in 3 different contexts. I want to think about New Zealand and the debate that sprung up leading up to the election, particularly around things like Maori language on road signs, issues around co-governance. And then I want to have a look at what's happened in Australia with their referendum about whether First Peoples in that country would be mentioned in the Constitution. And then finally, I want to just acknowledge the pain and suffering and lack of justice that is currently happening in Israel and Palestine. And to look at this, I want to have a look at what some of the leaders in the Anglican Church are doing and saying. Because sometimes I find when you're wondering, what is the just thing to do here? What is our response going to be? To have someone that you can look to and go, look at what they are doing. Is this something I can follow? Can be quite helpful. So looking at New Zealand, there has been this discussion, and it is based around justice. How do we honour the treaty? How do we ensure that the rights of Māori are protected, including the language in this country? And as this debate started unfolding, in Wellington, members of the Anglican Church did a rally and a protest in a way. And this dreadlocked person on the left here is the Bishop of Wellington. His name is Justin Duckworth. And he led a protest, and that was particularly because at the time there was a person called Julian Batchelor who was going around the country holding rallies, saying to people that co-governance was a terrible, terrible idea and we needed to fight it. And he did that, he said, from a Christian perspective. And here in Wellington and here in the Anglican Church said, we don't believe that is the Christian perspective. We believe that God is a God of justice. And here is a sort of a better view of what they're protesting about. And what I like in this is you can see all the little white collars of all the priests along here. And here they are with their signs, love thy neighbour, honour te tiriti, Christians for co-governance. Here's another image from that protest, Tau Iwi, or the people who signed the treaty supporting co-governance. Now, how is it that the Anglican Church, or why is it that they have come out so strongly in support of co-governance, this idea that Māori can govern their own affairs and Pākehā govern their own affairs? How has that happened? And the reason is, in the history of the Anglican Church, this is what we did. We decided that instead of having one structure for everyone, that we would go into something called Three Tikanga Church. Now, the church in New Zealand was also the Church of New Zealand, Aotearoa and Polynesia, and that had one archbishop that looked after everything. And there was a recognition that this actually didn't foster the voice of Pacifica, and it didn't foster the voice of Māori, because that one archbishop tended to be Pākehā. And then people had to fit into one way of doing things. And so it was dreamed and imagined, what would it look like for co-governance of this church? What would it look like if instead of having one archbishop, we had three, a Pākehā archbishop, a Māori archbishop, and a archbishop from Polynesia? And so this is what happened. And so the church, the Anglican Church in this land, has worked through this process of figuring out how to do co-governance. And it's this beautiful picture of three people working together and listening to each other, hearing from each other, gathering together and sharing ideas, but supporting and championing the differences in the way we do things, the differences in tikanga. And so this has emerged. And out of this journey, and kind of speaking into this context, there's been a really beautiful thing that has been spearheaded by the Archbishop of New Zealand, that's the Pākehā Archbishop, and that is that he has embarked in the Taranaki Cathedral on a project to educate people on what happened in the treaty and what has happened since. Now, I was talking to someone from our congregation here, who's Māori, and they said of all the places they have been in New Zealand, they found Taranaki the most racist. Now, often Christchurch gets that label, and he said, we have nothing on Taranaki. And when you look at Taranaki, hear the history, the issues are still live. Land was stolen. There was no deal done. People were imprisoned. People were killed. People were brutalised. And in the graveyard of the Taranaki Cathedral, which was used to store ammunition for the Pākehā army as they fought against Māori, in the graveyard there is graves that are just out and out racist. They say awful things like, this person died valiantly fighting savage Māori. And they stand in Taranaki and people defend them and say that's okay. So into this context, the Pākehā Archbishop has worked to create, with the Dean of the Cathedral, J. Ruka, who's Māori, acting in a Pākehā cathedral, this centre where they bring in school kids and groups, and it's these interactive screens. I got to visit it a few weeks ago, and it's this beautiful centre of education that our church, in terms of the wider Anglican Church, has paid for. We want to tell the story. We want to tell the story of the injustices that have happened in this land so that people understand why is it that Māori want to be able to manage their own affairs. So in this election, this issue has come up. And how do we respond to this? We have the ACT party in power, and one of the things they have said is they want a referendum. They want a referendum on the treaty. It's interesting, former treaty negotiation minister, former Attorney General Chris Finlayson, who I understand is a Christian, he writes this. He comments that a referendum would be dangerous. A referendum on such a potentially contentious topic could get out of control and bring to the surface elements that would shock New Zealanders and appall them. This is where our conversation is at the moment as a country. And we have to wrestle with this. How do we respond? If we are called to be a people who bring justice, what is our response to this? I think it's really interesting, Chris's observations, when you look at what happened in Australia the same time as our election. They had a referendum. Would they mention the First Peoples in Australia in their constitution? And the aim was that any legislation that directly affected them, they would have a say. It wasn't a veto, just a say, if a piece of legislation affected them. And when this was first mooted and Australian people were polled, 60% were in favour of this. Yes, they should be mentioned in the Constitution. But as time went on, there became another voice that emerged. And I think this is exactly the sort of thing that Chris Finlayson is warning us in New Zealand about. Here's a screenshot that I found of one of the campaigns saying, no, this is the words of it. Don't be fooled, Australia. This is what the voice, that's the referendum, is really about. The truth will be revealed after you fools have voted yes. You will all have accepted a bloodless coup to put in place an unelected black monarchy and apartheid. And then it will be too late, suckers, and that includes all you Aboriginals. You'll need another referendum to reverse it. But if one is proposed, no matter who is in government, the voice can just veto it. That is how much power it gives a small group of elites. You will have screwed Australia forever. You can thank that fool, Anthony Albanese. Wowza. This is what we're being warned against. We need to be careful in our country. Just beneath the surface, I think there is this underbelly of people who are afraid of things that are different and of new, and people who refuse to see the image of God in people different from themselves. And this is the call for Christians, to see that God has made all people, and God is revealed as we see all people. The Anglican Archbishop and the National Aboriginal Bishop in Australia wrote a response, and this is what they've said. Australia is moving steadily closer to the referendum on the voice to Parliament, and we will be asked to vote on whether we recognise the First Peoples of this land in the Constitution and provide them a voice to Parliament on legislation that impacts them. They write, it is simple and uncomplicated and appeals to the fairness of Australians to recognise First Peoples. It is simple and uncomplicated as it is about justice, acknowledging that there were people who lived in harmony with this land before the First Fleet arrived, and that they have suffered significantly and continue to do so, despite the many interventions in the past 150 years. It is simple and uncomplicated, in that it has no power to veto government legislation. It provides advice, input, and a voice for First Peoples. It is simple and uncomplicated. Do you and this nation believe it is time to address the original sin of invasion, the subsequent exclusion of the First People from the Constitution, and allow them a voice enshrined in that Constitution on matters impacting them? And then they make this really beautiful observation. As a statement from the Heart States on behalf of all First People, we invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. For Christians, this invitation by a people who have been decimated by colonisation to those who have benefited from it rivals the absurdly compassionate generosity of God, who sent his Son so that whoever believes in him will be saved. The sheer brutality of the cross is redeemed in the glory of the third day. It's time for this nation to enter the third day that followed the crucifixion and the darkness of the tomb. We invite you to join us on this journey. And most of Australians said no. This is the tough call for people who follow Jesus. Jesus came to bring good news to the poor, freedom for the captives, sight for the blind, and liberty for those who are oppressed. This is why Jesus said he came, and then invites us, come follow me. Come follow me. And this is something we have to wrestle with and try and understand. What does it mean to bring justice? What does it mean to see peace? Finally, I want to mention, because it's something that I think we can't avoid at the moment, the terrible atrocities that are happening in Israel and in Palestine. And I think when you read about this, it can be easy to come to quite quick conclusions, but this is a complex situation. I was looking at pictures of the peace agreements that have been signed over the years between the leaders of Israel and Palestine. And yet, there is still war. There is still suffering. And while I think as Christians it is right for us to long to see peace in that nation, there has to be acknowledgement that there's something far greater going on here, that peace treaties negotiated don't seem to be able to overcome. I think one of the things that we can do is we can look back for a couple of decades of history in this area, and then we can say, well, this is what it's all about. From 1948, from 1967, those wars, this is what this is about. But actually, these two people groups trace their origin story in this land in millennia. They have been there for thousands of years, and it hasn't always been good. One of the things I discovered as I was reading this week is I think this could be one of the most contested pieces of land in all history. If you go just back to 1300 BC, the area was ruled by the Egyptian Empire, and this was the empire that the Israelites escaped from, and they moved to this area and they lived alongside the Canaanites and the Philistines, not happily. Eventually the Assyrian Empire came and took over, and then the Babylonian Empire, and then the Persians, but the Persians allowed the Jews to actually exist and practice their religion. And then Egypt took over and Arabs settled in the Negev desert. And during this time, Aramaic became the most commonly spoken language, which later Jesus would speak. Then the Greeks came, then the Romans came, and that's when Jesus is born. And eventually, after Jesus' death and resurrection, the area becomes largely Christian under the Roman Empire. But then Islam begins to spread, and a number of people convert, and then it gets ruled by a series of caliphates. And then the Crusaders come, and they fight them, and they try and make it Christian again. And then, remarkably, which I did not know, the Mongols even made it down to Israel and managed to hold it for 4 months. And then the Ottomans came, and then the Egyptians again, and then the Ottomans. And then the Ottomans sided with the Germans in World War I and lost, and then the British took over. And on and on and on it goes. This is a highly contested piece of land, and it's a piece of land that people lay claim to. But I think the issue is the same in New Zealand, in Australia, Israel, Palestine. How do we learn to live alongside people who are different from us? And not just live alongside as the people in power. How do we live alongside in a way that honours people who are different from us? How do we learn to live generously And how do we learn if we have inherited the benefits of those in power that have exploited others? How do we live in such a way to bring and restore justice? On the issue of Israel and Palestine, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the head of the Anglican Church globally, wrote just after the tensions broke out a statement, and he says, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem, for they shall prosper that love thee," which is a quote from Psalm 122. And he writes, "Our grief and shock only grows greater as more devastating news and images emerge from the abhorrent terrorist attacks in Israel. The agonising suffering endured by those who are targeted and their families can scarcely be imagined. Our hearts are broken open by the grief of Israelis and our Jewish brothers and sisters around the world, for whom this trauma and loss stands in the dark and terrible shadow of the worst days of their history. I beg that those who have been taken hostage are set free into safety, and that they and their loved ones might be released from the horror of their captivity. The anger felt by the people of Israel at the cruelty they have experienced is entirely justified. Many around the world share in that anger. But in the face of a ground offensive in Gaza, I plead that the sins of Hamas are not borne by the citizens of Gaza, who themselves have faced such suffering over many decades. The price of evil cannot be paid by the innocent. Civilians cannot bear the cost of the terrorist. International humanitarian law recognises that, for the sake of everyone's humanity, some acts can never be permissible in the chaos of warfare. I pray that Israel does everything it can to limit the harm caused to innocent civilians. Over 2 million civilians in Gaza, half of them children, are facing a catastrophe. A humanitarian corridor and convoy are needed as rapidly as possible, as set out in the Geneva Conventions. I pray particularly for the Anglican-run Al-Ali Arab Hospital and all those caring for the injured who need medical supplies and generator fuel. I join with the US Secretary of State and others in urging the Israeli government to exercise their right of defence with the wisdom that might break the cycles of violence under which generations have struggled. Amidst the chaos and confusion of war, and as much as is possible, I join the calls for Israel's military response to be proportional and to discriminate between civilians and Hamas. Pray for the people of Israel. Pray for the people of Gaza. Pray for the people of the West Bank. Pray for the future of the Holy Land. Pray for those who will weep and fear and die tonight. Lord God, we pray by your great mercy, defend your children from all perils and dangers of this night. What a dreadful, dreadful situation. I think this is so nuanced that there is injustices being perpetrated on both sides, that neither side is innocent. Both of them are committing atrocities. And I think what we need to do is pray. And something remarkable needs to happen to break that silence. But as I mentioned, this goes back to this repeating pattern that happens generation after generation after generation, where we don't see people different from ourselves, like ourselves. And we discover that deep within us is the desire to discriminate, to treat people badly. So what can we do? I've been challenged by these voices raised by priests, by bishops, by archbishops. And I was reflecting, what can I do? So a couple of weeks ago, knowing I was going to be preaching on this topic, I decided to release my inner Karen. For those of you unfamiliar with that term, that is used to describe an angry white woman who likes to complain a lot. And I was like, come on out. Because I had a situation the other week where I was flying back from New Plymouth to Christchurch. And so I wrote this letter to Air New Zealand. and I thought I'd share it with you. On the 14th of September, I flew from New Plymouth to Wellington on flight NZ 8793 at 10:30am. Twice during the flight, the captain commented about scenery and he talked about Mount Egmont and Egmont National Park. I was surprised by this because I was sure those names had been officially changed. When I got off the flight, I checked, and sure enough, those haven't been the legal names since 2020. I was particularly sad because it was Māori Language Week, and all the other staff seemed to be making a conscious effort to speak more te reo. In light of that, the pilot's choice of words could only be read as a form of racism, a refusal to use the official name of a landmark because it was in the Māori language. To be honest, it felt very juvenile. I am Pākehā, but there are a lot of Māori on the flight, and I wondered how they felt listening to the pilot's comments. I don't believe this pilot's actions are in line with the image Air New Zealand projects during its safety videos, and therefore likely the culture that it is trying to foster. I'm writing to you today because I believe the pilot needs training in cultural competence and in what constitutes racism. I am not looking for an automated response to this complaint. I'm looking to hear what specific concrete actions Air New Zealand will be taking in regards to that specific pilot. I look forward to your reply, Carolyn Robertson. I got an automated response. It made me think I could have said nothing. It did really annoy me on that flight, but it would have been much easier to say nothing. I'm busy. I often don't even follow through with texts or emails. Some of you may have discovered that. But I thought, what is it if we all sit back and say nothing? What is it if we let injustice flourish? What is it if we say it's fine for you to use a word that isn't the legal language because you can't be bothered learning a bit more about a people that is different from yourself? And I think this is the challenge. When Jesus calls to fight for justice, it's not an abstract thing. It's a call to love other people and to love them for who they are and all their cultural packages and ways of doing things and tikanga. This is an invitation to love. And I think in all of it too, it is an invitation to humility. If you are in a group of people that holds power, what does it mean to give it up? And yet we follow Jesus, who gave up all his power, who sacrificed everything that we might be free. Let's pray together. Jesus, I want to thank you for the wisdom of the people who wrote these 5 marks of mission that challenge us to our very core. What does it mean to follow you? What does it mean to spread your kingdom news in this world? And Jesus, for some of us, we find it hard. There is much to lose. There is fear. But Jesus, I pray, meet us today. Fill us with your love so that love might flow over to all we meet. Open our hearts. May we learn to see all peoples of this world how you see them. May we be constantly reminded that all are made in the image of God. Fill us with your love that we might impact the world with your love. Amen.